Have you ever heard of a day when a simple dog's deviation decided the fate of an entire troop? It sounds like an exaggeration, but that's exactly what happened to the 82nd Airborne, and it's this moment that will keep you hooked until the very last second. Because what begins as a routine patrol, the kind every soldier thought would end quickly, ends up becoming one of the most unexpected and dangerous discoveries of the entire operation in occupied France. And the strangest thing is that none of this was planned. Nothing at all. It was a detail and unusual behavior of the dog that changed everything, and you'll understand why. The scene begins right after a heavy bombing raid in Normandy. The ground still trembled, the air reeked of gunpowder and hot iron, and the soldiers advanced through the ruins, unsure if any Germans were hiding there, waiting for the right moment to shoot. Nobody liked this part, walking without seeing the enemy. The tension was so thick you could feel it in your bones. But among all the men there was one who was restless in a different way, the patrol dog. He wasn't sniffing as usual. He wasn't looking for mines or ammunition scraps or bodies. He was fixated on something that only he seemed to notice. The handler, accustomed to interpreting the animal's every breath, was immediately puzzled. The dog pulled hard on the leash, growled softly, and stared at a house that was nothing more than a pile of broken stones and burnt wood. To any human, it was just another piece of rubble among so many others destroyed that day. But the puppy persisted, as if there were living people inside. Or worse, as if there was something that no soldier wanted to find. The Americans approached cautiously, expecting anything, a hidden enemy, a Nazi file, a civilian prisoner. But the truth was far more serious than that. As they began to remove the pieces of wall, hearing the dog barking desperately, everything changed. First came the silence. That silence that leaves the air strange, as if something were waiting to be revealed. Then a faint sound almost lost among the rubble, weak moans, human voices. And it wasn't a soldier calling for help. It was a whole family. A cellar that no one would have found without the dog was hidden beneath everything. The door was blocked by heavy beams, as if someone had deliberately prevented it from being opened. And when the soldiers finally reached them, the scene was breathtaking. Parents, 2 children, and a grandmother, all dirty, weak, trembling, with eyes so sunken they seemed to have lived through an endless nightmare. They didn't scream, they didn't ask for help. They just stared, as if they had seen the worst that war could offer. And it was right there, in that dark and cramped basement, that the story took a dramatic turn, because that family wasn't just hiding. They had been placed there by Nazi soldiers, soldiers who wanted to ensure that no one heard what they were doing outside. And what those people saw still trapped in that hole was something the Americans never imagined, something that would change the entire operation. And it all started with the persistent nose of a single dog. Did you notice how a simple movement by the dog completely changed the course of that patrol? If this beginning already got your pulse racing, imagine what's still to come. Before we continue, let me ask you a quick thing. If you like this kind of story and want to follow all the upcoming twists and turns, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. This helps our work a lot. And take the opportunity to comment below what city you're watching from. I really want to know how far this story is going. Let's continue. The beginning of it all seemed like just another typical day in occupied Normandy. Mud, smoke, the smell of gunpowder in the air, and that unsettling feeling that something could explode at any second. The soldiers of the 82nd Airborne advanced slowly between the destroyed houses, trying to identify if there were still Germans hiding there after the bombing. The sound of boots breaking pieces of wood, mixed with the distant crackle of artillery. It was a common scene for those who had already seen more destruction than they cared to remember. But on that particular day, there was one detail that no one could ignore: the behavior of the patrol dog. The German shepherd, trained to sniff out mines and locate hidden combatants, had been acting strangely from the start. He pulled hard on the leash, sniffing the air as if tracking something no soldier could sense. The handler tried to guide him along the normal route, but the dog clung to the ground and stared at a set of ruins that seemed completely irrelevant. That house had nothing that caught his attention. It was just another structure crushed by bombing, without any clear sign of life. Even so, the dog persisted, growling softly, focused on a single point, as if he were absolutely certain he needed to go there. The soldiers exchanged glances, Many had already learned that ignoring a war dog's sense of smell could cost lives, so, even without understanding why, they approached slowly. The dog grew increasingly nervous, pulling forward, scratching at the rubble as if trying to dig with its own paws. This didn't seem like warning behavior for enemies. It was different. It was urgent. It was as if the dog was warning that someone was there, someone who needed to be found immediately. As they began removing pieces of burnt wood and broken bricks, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't a loud noise nor a scream. It was a sound so faint it almost went unnoticed, a short, muffled groan coming from beneath the structure. At that moment, silence fell over the group. The handler knelt down, pressed his ear close to a beam and listened again. Someone was there, and it didn't sound like a soldier. It was a sound too faint, too slow, heavy with exhaustion. The men worked quickly, removing everything they could without causing further collapse. After a few minutes, a space finally appeared among the rubble, and behind it, the door to a basement partially crushed by the ceiling beams. There was no way to open it from the inside. It was clear that whoever was inside was trapped on purpose. That became clear immediately. It took 3 soldiers to lift and move the wood enough to pull the door open. When it gave way, revealing the dark interior of the cellar, no one was prepared for what they saw. Their eyes took a few seconds to adjust to the darkness, but when they finally could see, the shock hit them all at once. An entire family was crammed inside. A father, a mother, 2 small children, and an elderly woman who could barely open her eyes. They were all covered in dust, their faces gaunt, their clothes torn, and their bodies so thin it looked as if they hadn't eaten in days. The father tried to stand, but fell to the side, completely powerless. The mother held her youngest child in her arms, as if she were fighting to keep him alive with just her touch. The children were so weak they didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't react. They just stared at the soldiers with a terrifying emptiness in their eyes. The first question that crossed everyone's mind was, were they hiding or were they hidden? The answer came even before anyone asked. The way the door was locked, the boards pushed inward, the absence of food or water, everything pointed to the same conclusion. Someone had put that family there and wanted to make sure they wouldn't be found. It was impossible to see that and think they had hidden themselves. While the soldiers were pulling everyone out of the basement, the dog paced restlessly, sniffing the ground, looking at the hill behind the destroyed house, as if sniffing a scent that led to another place, not the basement. This made Jack, the handler, even more suspicious. He knew how to interpret the dog better than anyone there, and that behavior clearly indicated that this wasn't over. The family was just the first piece of something bigger. When they finally managed to get all the civilians seated on the ground, the father tried to say something. His voice was barely audible. He raised his trembling arm and pointed outside, towards the tall grass that began behind the destroyed houses. His eyes were wide, not from normal fear, but from someone who had seen something so serious that he knew it could cost him his life. He tried to take a deep breath and said, with great effort, "They didn't want us to tell you about the route." The word route landed like a bombshell among the soldiers. It wasn't just any comment. It wasn't something said by chance. If a family was locked in a basement to prevent them from talking about a route, it meant the Germans were using some secret path that didn't appear on Allied maps, a route important enough to justify condemning civilians to death as prisoners. And in that instant, even without understanding everything, everyone realized the same thing, that discovery wasn't simple. The family hadn't been found by chance. The dog wasn't restless by accident. There was something hidden behind that hill, something big, something the Germans didn't want anyone to know. And from that moment on, the patrol ceased to be just a patrol. They had just stumbled upon a secret that could change everything. The soldier responsible for the dog was called Jack Turner. He was a paratrooper who had seen more than any 23-year-old man should see. He wasn't the kind of hero you see on posters. He was quiet, serious, always with that expression of someone who hadn't slept well in weeks. But the unit trusted him for a simple reason. He was the only one who could understand every gesture, every breath, and every slightest change in the patrol dog's behavior. And that saved lives, many times. The dog's name was Ranger. Was a strong, dark-haired German shepherd, trained to detect mines, ambushes, buried bodies, and unusual movements. Ranger was the type of dog that didn't get agitated over just anything. He didn't bark impulsively. He didn't attack on empty instinct. He was controlled, focused, and accurate. That's why, when Ranger's behavior changed, Jack gave him immediate attention. Ranger never missed. Never. After they pulled the French family out of the basement, Jack noticed that Ranger hadn't relaxed for a second. Normally, the dog would calm down after locating survivors, but that day he remained restless, breathing heavily, constantly sniffing the air as if he were still tracking something only he could perceive. He repeatedly looked in the same direction, the hill behind the destroyed house. It was as if he were trying to warn Jack of something, but without yet finding the complete clue. Jack walked up the hill, Ranger beside him. The ground was soft, full of explosion marks, small craters, scattered pieces of wood and metal, nothing out of the ordinary for that part of Normandy. But Ranger wasn't interested in the obvious marks. He sniffed the ground as if following a very faint, almost faded trail, but one that still called to him. Jack observed everything attentively. Ranger never insisted unnecessarily. Meanwhile, behind him, the troops were trying to stabilize the family. The father was very weak, but he kept repeating the same thing in French, his voice broken. They didn't want us to tell about the route. Jack heard it from a distance, but every word seemed to fit Ranger's attitude. The dog wasn't reacting to the basement. He was reacting to something connected to that route, something that probably started nearby. Jack returned to where the civilians were and knelt before his father. The man seemed to struggle with his own body to be able to speak. The soldier asked the interpreter for help. Even so, the sentences came out broken, with long pauses between each word. The father explained that German soldiers appeared every night. They carried heavy boxes, spoke softly, and always looked towards the hill before disappearing into a spot the family couldn't see completely. One day, the family tried to ask what they were doing. Result, they were dragged to the basement and locked in. The mother, still trembling, added that she heard one of them say, "If you talk, it'll be over before dawn." The children nodded in confirmation, with a fear that seemed to have clung to them like a shadow. As everyone listened, Jack felt the logic forming in his head. Germans moving crates, weapons, maybe fuel, maybe ammunition, always in the same direction, disappearing behind the hill, and a family locked up, preventing them from talking about it. And now Ranger, the unit's most precise dog, was fixated precisely on that spot. It was too much of a coincidence. Jack took a deep breath. His stomach was a mixture of adrenaline and alertness. In war, when two different clues point to the same place, you don't ignore them. You investigate or you die later regretting not having investigated. He knew this from his training. He knew this from Sicily. He knew this from seeing men die because of overlooked details. He stood up, called the sergeant, and reported everything. The sergeant didn't like what he heard at all. A secret German route in that region meant the Nazis were moving something big, perhaps reinforcements, perhaps ammunition, perhaps essential supplies. And worse, if it was a hidden route, the Allies hadn't mapped it. In other words, the American army could be caught off guard at any moment. This could turn into a complete disaster. While the men discussed what to do, Ranger remained restless, pacing in circles, scratching the ground near the hill. Jack looked at him and understood the message without needing words. Something was hidden there, and it needed to be found. Tension rose. The soldiers began to wonder if they should call for reinforcements, but calling for reinforcements meant giving away their position. And if the Germans realized they had been discovered, they might abandon the route, hide it better, or worse, set up a deadly ambush. Jack made the decision even before receiving the order. He placed his hand on Ranger's collar and simply said, "Show it." Ranger began to walk slowly, following that invisible trail. The other soldiers began to follow them in absolute silence. Each step increased the feeling that they were approaching something big. And at that moment, Jack already knew that what the family had hidden and what the Germans had tried to erase was only the beginning. Ranger sensed something that no one else could see, and whenever that happened, something important was about to be discovered. And it didn't take long for the patrol to realize that that hill hid more than anyone imagined. The patrol followed silently behind Ranger, each man watching his own pace, as if any heavier movement could betray their presence. The vegetation on the hill wasn't dense enough to hide a battalion, but it was perfect for camouflaging quick movements. Tall grass, small bushes, uneven terrain, and some patches where the ground looked like it had been disturbed weeks before. Nothing there screamed enemy route, but nothing seemed natural either. It was exactly the kind of place where Germans could go unnoticed. And if there was one thing the German army knew how to do well, it was to hide paths that didn't officially exist. Ranger advanced with unerring aim, his nose pressed to the ground, following a specific scent that only he could identify. Jack watched the dog's every move, attentive to the slightest signs, stiffening of posture, paws stopping at specific points, accelerated breathing. Every detail of Ranger's behavior indicated that they were on the right track, or at least on a track that someone didn't want them to discover. After a few minutes climbing the hill, Jack began to notice something strange. The undergrowth was flattened in certain sections, as if small carts or motorcycles had passed through. It wasn't enough to reveal a military route, but it was an odd pattern for an area that supposedly had no use whatsoever. Normally, markings left by troops were much more obvious, but if the Germans were trying to hide something big, perhaps they had developed a route with minimal traffic so as not to attract attention. Ranger stopped suddenly near an area of darker soil, as if it had been recently disturbed. He put his front paws on alert, his tail stiff, his ears pricked up. It was a clear sign that something was there. Jack knelt down to examine the ground. At first glance, it looked like just earth mixed with charcoal, which was common in bombed areas. But when he dug a few centimeters with his knife, he realized that the surface layer was too thin to be natural. Someone had spread that material there to disguise tracks. "This is all made up," Jack murmured, and the sergeant approached. The sergeant ran his hand along the ground and frowned. He knew that tactic. German soldiers used to cover tire tracks with dark dirt and fragments of charcoal to make them harder to spot from the air. It wasn't foolproof, but it worked well enough to fool an unsuspecting patrol. They were standing right on top of a camouflaged route. The atmosphere grew heavier. Each man looked towards the horizon as if expecting to see an enemy soldier appear at any moment. Ranger continued walking, following the trail now faster, as if he had found a stronger scent. The soldiers needed to follow him without raising dust, without making noise, without attracting the attention of anyone who might be watching from some hidden spot. They already knew they were stirring up a hornet's nest and couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The trail led the group to a section of the hill that looked completely identical to the rest. Grass, loose stones, small holes left by explosions. But when they reached the top, the view on the other side made everyone freeze. The path down the hill was more marked, full of footprints, boot marks, and thin tracks similar to those left by motorcycles or small vehicles. It was subtle, but it was there. It wasn't a trail used by civilians fleeing bombings. It was a functional, active route used recently. Ranger moved forward a few meters and stopped beside a fallen tree. Jack observed and noticed that the tree hadn't been felled by an explosion or wind. It had been cut, down deliberately, and positioned to partially cover the trail entrance. A disguise. Simple, cheap, efficient. "They're using this at night," said one of the soldiers. "This thing is invisible from the air every day." The sergeant nodded. The explanation made sense. American night bombing raids happened at predictable times. If the Germans used the trail between those intervals, it was almost impossible for them to be detected. This would open a path for transporting ammunition, equipment, radios, food, and even small troops moving around unnoticed. Jack stepped back a little, trying to see where that route led. The trail led into a small wooded area ahead, and that's where Ranger was staring now. The dog was motionless but tense, as if he smelled something very specific and very dangerous. This put everyone even more on alert. Ranger never acted like that without reason. The sergeant ordered a slow approach. Each soldier raised his rifle, keeping their distance to avoid being caught in a group ambush. The sound of footsteps was muffled by the damp ground. Adrenaline surged. The patrol was on the verge of a discovery too big to ignore. As they entered the woods, Ranger began sniffing frantically, heading straight for a spot where the ground seemed sunken, with deeper tire tracks. There the terrain had been used more intensively. Jack noticed something that sent shivers down his spine. There were small pieces of paper and torn tarpaulin caught on the low branches, as if boxes had been hastily transported there. But what really made the patrol stop was the remains of a German ammunition box thrown behind a tree trunk. It was partially buried, as if someone had tried to hide it, but the characteristic smell of military grease gave away its origin. Ranger recognized it immediately, growling softly, his fur standing on end. The trail wasn't just a transport route. It was part of something bigger, something active, something the Germans were using to fuel an operation the Americans hadn't yet mapped out. Jack looked at the sergeant and said what everyone was already thinking. This isn't just a hidden trail. This is a military corridor. And at that moment, no one had any more doubts. The secret route really did exist, and they were walking right in the middle of it. The patrol advanced deeper and deeper along the hidden trail, and each meter covered increased the certainty that this was no simple improvised passage. The silence of the woods was strange, too heavy for a place that apparently had no constant movement. But inside, one only needed to look a little closer to notice the details that revealed the truth. Broken branches with clean cuts, marks of recent boots, leaves forever shifted in the same direction. This was not nature. It was logistics. Ranger continued guiding the group with impressive precision. He didn't bark, didn't run, didn't hesitate. He sniffed the air, took 2 steps forward, stopped, sniffed again. This caution was a clear sign that he was sensing the presence of something nearby, but still distant enough not to be perceived as an immediate threat. Jack didn't take his eyes off the dog. The soldier's breathing grew shorter, marked by the awareness that they were dealing with something much bigger than they had planned. About 50 meters later, the trail began to descend, forming a natural corridor through the vegetation. The descent was gentle but long, and the sound of the soldier's footsteps was almost swallowed by the damp earth. Suddenly, Ranger froze in place, his whole body rigid. Jack immediately raised his fist, the universal signal for the group to freeze. Not a single soldier took a deep breath. Ranger's expression said it all. There was something ahead, and it wasn't small. Jack approached slowly, his gaze fixed on the dog. Ranger stood staring at a spot between 2 thick trees, as if he knew exactly what was there, but was waiting for permission to move forward. When Jack reached the spot and touched the ground with his hand, he felt a faint vibration, as if something heavy had recently passed by. The sergeant approached and did the same. It was the pulse of the ground after constant traffic. Upon closer inspection, they noticed that the trees were marked with small, almost invisible horizontal cuts, made at knee height. It was a rudimentary type of code used by the Germans to mark supply routes. Anyone passing by knew exactly where to turn, where to stop, where to hide. It was definitive proof. That trail wasn't just secret. It was planned. It was organized. It was part of a network. "They pass through here all the time," the sergeant said, almost in a whisper. "This is an active operational route." The ranger continued on, and the further they advanced, the more evidence emerged. Wider tire tracks, traces of boxes being dragged, a piece of grey fabric caught on a branch, an open can of German military rations thrown into a hole. Each item seemed insignificant in isolation, but together they formed a very clear picture. The Germans were transporting something large through there, and had been doing so for weeks. The turning point that shifted the alert group's mood from one of extreme tension to another came when they found a camouflage structure among rocks and bushes, a kind of makeshift depot. It wasn't large, but it was carefully hidden. Jack noticed it first, spotting the faint glint of metal among the leaves. When they cleared the fire area, they saw 3 large, partially buried boxes. The inscriptions were clear, even covered in dirt. German ammunition for MG-42 machine guns. If heavy ammunition was passing through there, then the route was supplying larger positions, perhaps a hidden garrison, perhaps a reinforcement point, perhaps even a supply route to retreat troops without being seen by Allied aircraft. This put the 82nd Airborne at real risk. They were in the middle of a route used to sustain enemy attacks. "This place is too big," a soldier muttered. "We should call for reinforcements." Jack agreed, but before he could say anything, Ranger growled. Not a light warning growl. It was that deep, grave growl the dog makes when it detects a hostile presence. Everyone pointed their weapons in the direction of the warning. Ranger stood motionless, focused on a specific point in the woods ahead. The sergeant ordered everyone to get down. The group remained motionless for long seconds, listening for any sign that they were not alone. It was then that they heard light but hurried footsteps advancing through the undergrowth. Someone was coming along the same trail in their direction. The group's breathing quickened. They were in a terrible position, a narrow, restricted route with no room for quick maneuvers. If it were a German patrol, they could easily be surrounded. The ranger suddenly looked at Jack, as if asking for urgent instructions. Jack knew he needed to decide quickly: retreat, advance, or ambush. The sergeant approached and whispered that the group should prepare for confrontation. The soldiers positioned themselves around the trail, hidden behind rocks, bushes, and trees, creating an ambush semicircle. The footsteps drew closer, the sound of metal clanging lightly, perhaps a rifle being adjusted. There were at least 2 men, maybe 3. Then, out of nowhere, the footsteps stopped. Total silence. It was as if the Germans had sensed something wrong in the air. Ranger kept growling, but didn't advance, showing that this was serious. Jack gripped the rifle tightly between his fingers, feeling the sweat trickle between his palm and the cold wood. Endless seconds passed until the footsteps began again, but now moving away, heading in the opposite direction. The German patrol didn't advance far enough to see the American group, but passed close enough to realize that something was amiss. As soon as silence returned, the sergeant made a quick gesture, ordering everyone to move. They couldn't stay there. Discovering that depot and that trail meant they were very close to something crucial, perhaps the entire base where the Germans coordinated movements throughout that region. Ranger resumed his position at the front of the group. Now the dog was even more tense. The scent he was following seemed stronger, clearer. There was something big at the end of that route, something that explained the trapped family, the hidden depot, the camouflaged trail, and the enemy patrol. And Jack knew from Ranger's demeanor that they were just minutes away from finding out exactly what it was, and whatever they were about to find, it wasn't small. After the enemy patrol retreated, the sergeant wasted no time. He knew that standing still was asking to be surrounded. The order came low, firm, and short: advance, and everyone obeyed without question, because they had already understood that that trail hid something too big to wait for reinforcements. If they were surrounded, they would be eliminated. If they turned back without information, they would lose their only chance to reveal a crucial enemy weakness. It was the kind of situation where no one was completely safe, but turning back was even more dangerous than moving forward. Ranger took the lead again, almost dragging Jack along with his determined advance. The dog's behavior changed. He wasn't just sniffing a trail. He was following a specific, strong scent, as if he had finally found the core of what he was looking for. This made Jack even more tense. He knew that kind of posture. Ranger only acted like that when he was close to something very important or very dangerous. The trail began to steepen and narrow. The trees closed in, forming a kind of natural corridor, perfect for concealing movement. The soldiers had to walk hunched over, alert to any sound. The air seemed heavier, thicker, as if someone had passed by recently. And it wasn't their imagination. The smell of fresh smoke mingled with that of military grease. This could only mean one thing: there was German equipment operating nearby. About 30 meters ahead, Ranger stopped again, his body stiff. Jack put his ear to the ground and heard something that chilled his spine. A continuous vibration, not of the ground but of the air. A low hum like the sound of engines turning off and on. This was different from the trail traffic. It was mechanical, constant. It wasn't a truck passing by. It was something parked, something big. The sergeant ordered 2 soldiers to crawl forward to explore. They disappeared into the vegetation, and for several minutes no one breathed a sigh of relief, until one of them returned with a face full of shock, as if he had seen something far worse than he expected. "Sir, you need to see this." The entire group advanced slowly, guided by the soldier. After skirting some dense bushes and crouching under low branches, they reached a point where the undergrowth opened into a small natural clearing, and there, hidden almost perfectly, was something none of them had imagined finding: a camouflaged German cargo center, functioning silently as if it were just part of the forest. 5 trucks were parked, painted in shades of green and brown that blended with the vegetation. Beside them, large crates were stacked, covered with grey tarpaulin. Several crates, dozens, perhaps more than 100. The smell of fresh fuel hung in the air. Trails of recent footprints showed that soldiers had been there minutes before. The clearing had been transformed into a clandestine transport point by the Germans, supplying some larger operation. "This is a transit base," Jack murmured, almost in disbelief. "They're moving heavy weaponry without any map to record it." But that wasn't all. The detail that caught Jack's attention was a set of metal plates stacked in a corner, partially covered by a tarp. He slowly lifted the tarp, and what he saw made his stomach sink. Anti-tank mine parts, detonating wires, detonators, and molded explosive boxes. It wasn't just a supply depot. It was an assembly point. The Germans were setting up explosive traps there, and probably distributing them along the secret route to catch American troops by surprise. This meant the entire region was about to become a mobile minefield, ready to destroy Allied armor, impede advances, and cause massive casualties. It was a gigantic discovery. The sergeant bent down and picked up a detonator. The piece was new, clean, dust-free, a clear sign of recent use. He looked at Jack with a hard expression. "If they spread this stuff all over the main trail, we'll lose our entire companions in one afternoon." Jack agreed. He felt Ranger cling to his side, the dog's body still tense, as if warning that this wasn't the end. The scent Ranger was following wasn't just coming from the warehouse. It was coming from something even bigger, something beyond that clearing. While they were exploring the area, another soldier urgently called the group over. He had found something partially buried, something that seemed simple at first glance, a folded map stuck under a stone. But when the sergeant unfolded the paper, there was a moment of absolute silence. The map showed not only that secret trail, but 4 different connections forming an invisible network that passed through villages, streams, and neutral zones, all unknown to the Allies. The Germans were maneuvering behind American lines with complete freedom, using routes that no aircraft could detect. "This is a whole network," said the sergeant. "They're moving reinforcements straight to the coast. This could turn the tide of the battle." And at that moment, the importance of discovering the family trapped in the basement became clear. They hadn't been locked up out of random cruelty. They had seen soldiers using that hidden route. If they had told someone, the Americans might have discovered it sooner. Suddenly, Ranger growled deeply. Staring at a point beyond the clearing, Jack understood the message. There was more, much more, and what lay ahead was the real reason for that route's existence, the central point of the German operation. Jack looked at the sergeant. He didn't need to say anything. Everyone had understood. The greatest discovery was yet to come. The map found confirmed that the trail the patrol was following was not just a discreet shortcut, but an entire artery of enemy movement, connecting strategic points that no American had on their radar. But what really made Jack tense wasn't the map. It was Ranger. The dog wouldn't leave a specific point beyond the clearing, as if the scent he'd been following since the village was getting stronger and stronger. His body was rigid. His snout pointed at a series of thick trees that rose like a natural wall. He lowered his body as if he were about to lunge at something invisible. Jack recognized that posture. That wasn't ordinary alertness. It wasn't sniffing out ammunition, nor trail reconnaissance. It was the posture Ranger only assumed when he was within a few meters of human presence, and hostile presence at that. The sergeant understood the message even before Jack said anything. He ordered the group to spread out, keeping a distance of 5 meters between each soldier. The fear of ambush was real. The Germans could be guarding the center of the operation, and if that were the case, the enemy wouldn't be there with 2 or 3 men. They would be with many, and nobody wanted to die at the hands of a patrol that knew the woods better than they did. Ranger advanced slowly, sniffing, guiding the group beneath the dense trees. The vegetation changed. It became denser, more stifling, as if it had been manipulated to block the view from above. This was common in clandestine operations. The Germans used branches and leaves to create a kind of green roof, hiding the movements of reconnaissance aircraft. And the further they walked, the more evident it became that they had entered a place where they shouldn't be found. About 20 meters further on, the woods suddenly opened up, and ahead, instead of small clearings, the group saw something far worse, an improvised complex. However, it was well organized, hidden as if it were part of the terrain. It was as if the Germans had set up a complete base behind that hill, protected from the air and connected by invisible routes. The size of the structure made everyone hold their breath. There were camouflaged tents, stacked ammunition boxes, fuel barrels, tables with maps and radios, and, most impressively, a group of German soldiers in formation, preparing equipment. They were completely oblivious to the fact that an American patrol was watching them just a few meters away. From a distance, It was possible to see at least 12 men. There could have been more inside the tents. There could have been many more. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst was on the right side of the camp, a natural bunker built inside a rock formation, partially covered with tarpaulin and vegetation. It was guarded by 2 soldiers armed with MP40s. Behind the entrance, large boxes were marked with symbols that everyone there knew very well: high-powered explosives. The logic was clear. This was not just a transit point. It was a coordination center for attacks, sabotage, and the movement of supplies throughout the Normandy region. The sergeant swallowed hard. He knew the magnitude of the problem. If that bunker were destroyed, the Germans would lose communication, supplies, routes, and the ability to advance. But if the base detected the Americans, the entire patrol would be massacred in minutes. While they were assessing the area, one of the soldiers pointed to something that made Jack's blood run cold: improvised antennas. The cables, nestled among trees and connected to powerful radios, were a central hub for receiving and transmitting information. The secret route wasn't merely logistical. It fed a much larger operation, coordinating attacks, retreats, and troop repositioning. If that continued to work, the Germans would have an absolute advantage in the region. While everyone was absorbing the shock, Ranger growled again. Jack followed the dog's gaze and realized what he had already noticed. There was movement coming from the bunker. 3 soldiers emerged, carrying a large box, walking quickly towards one of the trucks. They were talking hurriedly, visibly tense. One of them gestured towards the radio, as if something urgent had been transmitted minutes before. Jack felt the adrenaline surge. He remembered his family trapped in the basement. They had seen the Germans coming and going. They had seen trucks. They had seen soldiers carrying crates. They had seen this intense activity. And now it all made sense. The family had seen the base in operation, and that's why they were silenced. Ranger took 2 steps forward, but Jack held the leash tightly. If the dog moved forward now, the patrol would be discovered. They needed to observe. They needed to understand what was being carried. They needed to identify the weak point of that base. Then came the moment that defined everything. One of the German soldiers shouted something to the others. He hurriedly opened the box, and for a second the Americans saw its contents. Detailed maps of American positions, attack routes, artillery coordinates, and advance markers. This was extremely valuable strategic information. A leak of it would completely change the course of the battle. Jack felt his throat go dry. It was very clear. If those maps reached their final destination, probably another Nazi base or some high-ranking commander, hundreds of Americans would die in the next few hours. And it was precisely at that moment that Ranger began to tremble with alertness, sniffing something specific coming from the bunker. It was the human scent he had been following from the beginning. It wasn't that of German soldiers. It was another scent, a faint, hidden scent trapped behind that structure. Ranger knew. He always knew. Jack finally understood. Whatever was inside that bunker was the key piece of the puzzle, the key that the Germans were protecting, the key that explained the secret route, the key that explained the family's imprisonment, the key that explained why Ranger hadn't rested for a single second since leaving the village. Jack looked at the sergeant. "There's someone in there," he said, "and whoever it is, the Germans didn't want anyone to find them." The sergeant took a deep breath. Ranger growled. Everything was about to explode, literally or not. But one thing was certain. The biggest revelation was still behind that door. The group stood motionless, each soldier trying to figure out how to approach the bunker without revealing their presence. The German base was full of armed men, vehicles, ammunition, and radios. One wrong step, and the patrol would be wiped off. The map before they could even fire. But Ranger wasn't worried about the camp. The dog didn't move a glance for a second. He kept his full attention on the bunker door, growling softly, with that posture Jack had only seen a few times, when someone was locked in, wounded, and trying to survive in silence. Jack took a step forward, approaching the sergeant. "Ranger isn't indicating an enemy," he said in a firm whisper. "There's someone trapped inside." The sergeant frowned. "Prisoner? Here?" He looked around again. The camp had an extensive military structure, but keeping prisoners there seemed too risky. "Are you sure?" Jack pointed at the dog. "Absolutely. He's been on the trail since the village. The smell is the same." That's when it all clicked for everyone. The French family said that the Germans appeared repeatedly before locking them in the basement. They saw movement, they saw boxes, they saw soldiers coming and going. But the detail that no one had considered until that moment was that the family wasn't the only one who knew the route. That's become clear now. The sergeant gestured, indicating that the group would bypass the camp from the side, advancing silently through the woods. They walked slowly, almost crawling, hidden by tree trunks and shadows. Ranger led the way, crouching, as if he knew that any noise above the minimum would destroy everything. As they approached, the sounds of the camp became clearer. Voices, metal being dragged, trucks being loaded. It was organized chaos. After a few minutes, they reached the closest point to the bunker without being seen. 2 German guards watched the entrance, chatting casually, unaware that an American patrol was just a few meters away. The path to reach them was narrow, surrounded by dense vegetation. It was risky, but not impossible. The sergeant called Jack and 2 other experienced soldiers. They advanced crawling, using every inch of shade for cover. Ranger stayed behind, waiting for the signal. When they were close enough, the sergeant raised 3 fingers, then 2, then 1, and at the mark, the 3 Americans advanced simultaneously. The action was swift. 1 blow to the first guard's weapon, another muffling the second's scream. In less than 5 seconds, 2 bodies were on the ground. Ranger ran to the door and began scratching at the wood, emitting a slight growl, almost like a warning. Jack pushed the door open slowly. It was locked by a metal bar. He strapped his rifle to his back and, with a calculated effort, lifted the bar until it came loose. The door opened with a dry creak. The smell inside was of mold, sweat, dried blood, and fear. It was the kind of odor Ranger always detected first. Jack turned on a small flashlight. The light cut through the darkness and revealed something no one expected. There was 2 people locked inside, a Frenchman and an American woman. Both were bound, malnourished, and with their faces covered in bruises. The woman was wearing a partially torn American uniform, but she wasn't a soldier. She was an intelligence cartographer. Her hands were marked by ropes, and her mouth was injured from being tied up for a long time. When the light hit her face, she blinked slowly, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Jack ran up to her and cut the ropes with a knife. "You're safe," he said. "We're from the 82nd. She took a deep breath and touched her own chest, as if trying to remember that she was still alive. You can't let them send the maps," she said weakly. "They've discovered our positions. They know exactly where we're going to attack. They were about to send everything to high command." The Frenchman confirmed with a nod. "They use this route to bypass the American advance. If those maps get there, their men will fall into a giant ambush." The base made sense now. The boxes, the radios, the constant transport, the Germans' concern with silencing anyone who saw too much. The French family was locked in the basement because of this woman and this Frenchman. They tried to escape and were captured. The family saw, and for that reason, they were also silenced. Ranger turned his head suddenly, growling louder. Jack understood. Someone was coming. The sergeant appeared in the doorway, breathless. They noticed the guards. The entire base is on alert. It was at that moment that Jack realized there wouldn't be time for a full operation. They had to destroy that base now. Because if they let the Germans send the information, hundreds or thousands of Americans would die. The sergeant removed some grenades, scattered them around the structure, positioned improvised charges among the ammunition boxes, and pointed them toward the woods. "We have 30 seconds. Run!" The group ran in desperate silence, pulling the prisoners along, while Ranger remained by Jack's side, every muscle of the dog vibrating with urgency. When they were at a safe distance, the sergeant detonated the explosive. The explosion lit up the entire forest, raising dust, uprooting tree trunks, and transforming the secret camp into a fireball that engulfed everything. Trucks, maps, radios, explosives, antennas, and the entire German operation that functioned there. The German soldiers ran, screamed, tried to fight back, but it was too late. The base was destroyed in a matter of seconds. Jack looked at Ranger. The dog was panting, but with that firm look of someone who had accomplished what he needed to do. He hadn't just found a family. He had found the key that dismantled an entire operation. On that day, the 82nd Airborne avoided a disaster that would have changed the course of the campaign. And it all started because a dog didn't ignore what it felt. A dog that single-handedly destroyed a secret route that would have killed hundreds of Americans. a dog that unknowingly changed the course of the war. After all this, tell me, did you imagine that a single dog would be able to bring down an entire operation that could change the course of the war? The big lesson here is clear. Small signs, when ignored, become tragedies, but when someone pays attention, entire lives are saved. If this story captivated you, remember to like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on which city you're watching from. Your support makes all the difference in allowing us to continue bringing you stories like this.